evening, everyone. My name is Tanner Mirrlees, a prof in the Communication and Digital Media Studies program at Ontario Tech University and a member of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism. Welcome to tonight's event, Fueling Extractive Populism in Canada, Social Media, Subsidized Publics, and Petro-nationalism, the third and final webinar in the CHBE series, The Far-Right Energy Politics, Carbon Capital, Petro-nationalisms, and Anti-Environmental Media. We at the CHBE organized tonight's event with the support of the good folks of the Petrocultures Research Group, the Energy Humanities Network, and the Climate Commons Working Group at Carleton University. I'd like to start by saying a little bit about today's researchers and their work. Shane Gunster is a professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University and a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. His research and teaching focus on news and advocacy communication around the politics of climate and energy, with an emphasis on how social media platforms and alternative news media outlets engage and mobilize different publics in different ways around the climate crisis. Bob Neubauer is an assistant professor in the Department of Rhetoric, Writing, and Communications at the University of Winnipeg. His research explores the media strategies of Canadian environmental and pro-resource extraction social movements, with a focus on populist discourse, public mobilization around proposed energy infrastructure, and digital platforms. Darren Fleet is a lecturer at Simon Fraser University, and his research interests include advertising, environmental discourse, petrocultures, religious social movements, and the cultural politics of fossil fuels in Canada. A big thanks to these critical energy and environmental communication and media researchers for joining us this evening for the event. I encourage everyone to take a look at their important research publications, and you can learn a little bit more about them by checking out their publications by following the links in the comments bar. Okay, a warm welcome to Shane, Bob, and Darren.
All right, thank you so much for having us, and it's really great to be here. I'll just jump right into sharing a few slides to go with this presentation. Okay, here we go. So today I just want to walk everyone through a study I began in 2019 to set some context for Shane and Darren's talk. Actually, this study built off an earlier study I worked on, led by Shane, studying the strategy shift for the fossil fuel industry's communications work, this kind of shift towards the establishment of pro-industry advocacy groups. And there's some context for this shift, right? I mean, the initial context was kind of a growing worry about social movement opposition to industry expansion that was really reaching a fever pitch by the 2010s. This included both climate campaigners concerned largely with the climate impacts of new oil sands mega projects, but also regional, often First Nations-led movements concerned equally with local impacts of these pipeline and tanker projects in British Columbia and Quebec, like the now defunct Northern Gateway project and the now nationalized Trans Mountain Extension, and so on. And not only was this opposition contributing to the canceling and delay of some of these projects, but industry also had concerns with the election of a TMX opposing NDP Green coalition government in British Columbia in 2014, and the election of the Trudeau Liberals the following year, who did begin pursuing some contentious environmental legislation, or contentious to industry anyway. And so to counter this opposition, industry and their allies started pursuing what the sociologist Edward Walker calls a subsidized public strategy. This is where elites support the development of their own social movements by targeting stakeholders, like often an industry's workforce, and providing those stakeholders with the resources, infrastructure, and targeted mobilization opportunities of an organized campaign. And so a major goal was to provide supporters with communication materials they could in turn share with their own communities to legitimize industry talking points, and then use those talking points to mobilize supporters in support of industry, like showing up to protests, calling their representatives to amend unwanted environmental legislation, and so on. And as noted by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers when they outlined this strategy in a 2012 trade publication, called The Engagement Issue, they said this conversation has to start within our industry and expand outward from there, right? So along this strategy shift, we've seen a parallel development around the same time, really a few years later, right? First, the rise of a sprawling network of highly successful online conservative populist advocacy groups and influencers, including the wildly successful Proud groups, and also the rise of alternative conservative digital media. Initially, the alt-right, outlet Rebel Media, followed by slightly more respectable kind of alt-light media like Post Millennial and True North. And these actors, I think it's important to note, seem to operate both as political advocates, but also as business entrepreneurs, like you would find elsewhere in the online influencer and clickbait economy. And so in 2019, I worked with my colleagues, Nick Graham and Helena Krobeth, to build a research project to study these developments as part of the Corporate Mapping Project, a national research network that studies Canada's fossil fuel industry. And we included in our sample some of the most prominent advocacy groups kind of engaging in this work. These included official fossil fuel industry association outreach programs like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Energy Citizens, the Alberta Oil Drillers, a similar program, Oil Respect, and the Business Council of BC's Resource Works. We also included nominally independent fossil fuel advocacy groups like Canada Action and Oil Sands Strong. I say nominally independent because Canada Action in particular has actually received a good deal of industry funding. And then there's the conservative populist digital advocacy groups who discuss climate and energy, but they don't exclusively focus on those issues. And they don't always have particularly strong organizational ties to that industry. And so we included the granddaddy of them all, Canada Proud, an organization that mostly seeks to boost the electoral chances of the Conservative Party, run by Jeff Ballingall, a Conservative Party comms strategist. So you can already kind of see there's some diversity in the types of groups we were looking at. And most of these groups had gained really large followings on their official Facebook groups. Energy Citizens currently has like 270,000 likes, Proud about 500,000. And we scraped these groups' public Facebook posts over a 6-month period in 2019. And we came to understand their digital advocacy as a kind of connective leadership, in which key groups and accounts strategically intervene in otherwise chaotic and decentralized social media-enabled social movements to shape their direction. Of what would otherwise just be like a lot of just decentralized kind of chaotic activity online. And we found the groups in our sample exercise this leadership through a few things. First, very consistent populist messaging, the sharing of material from a common pool of other allied pro-fossil fuel and often industry-supported actors to kind of build this kind of echo chamber effect. They also worked to remix and reframe their allies' information into more shareable talking points supporting their populist messaging. They would use various techniques to generate high engagement, and they also directed supporters to various mobilization opportunities, often organized by the groups themselves or their corporate backers. So for instance, we'd actually found some diversity in these groups' messaging, but we also found a good deal of consistency. For instance, we'd say every group in our sample deployed variations of a common, what we called an extractive populist narrative, building off Shane's development of that concept earlier. And this narrative really all consists of 2 parts. First, that Canada's fossil fuel industry is sustainable and economically benefits Canada and the so-called average Canadian, including workers, taxpayers, consumers, even First Nations. And second, that Canada was now under attack from environmentalists, anti-Canadian elites, and foreigners attacking the industry. But in this discourse wouldn't usually be put together in a single Facebook post, right? It emerged over the flow of these groups' feeds as they communicated discrete discursive frames or tropes that together formed this narrative, right? So first off, the attack opponents frame, just attacking opponents. This was by far the most common frame in our sample across all groups. And it was the only frame which consistently generated a disproportionate amount of reactions, shares, and comments. And notably, Facebook's leaked internal research showed that around the time of this study, the platform was recommendation algorithms were disproportionately recommending content which elicited angry reactions and other kind of emotional emojis more than simple likes, right? And so in these posts, industry opponents real or perceived, depending on how you want to think of Trudeau, were described as hypocrites who used oil in their daily lives, who lied about the industry's environmental impact, and were often described as socioeconomic elites, foreigners or anti-Canadian traders. So you have like graphics like this shared 2,400 times, portraying Trudeau as a corrupt elite hypocrite whose carbon tax is like ripping off drivers while he subsidizes a private jet company. Other graphics mock like American eco-celebrities who lecture Canadians about climate change while stepping off their private jets, like Arnold here. And when Canadian activists were discussed, these groups focused on the blogger Vivian Krause's research on the funding some Canadian green groups had received from US foundations to portray anti-pipeline movements as this kind of traitorous conspiracy of anti-Canada green groups backed by global and US elites. Or as Canada Action put it, every court action to cancel pipelines was initiated by different tentacles of the same American master plan to kill our industry. And they call leftists paranoid. However, there was diversity amongst these groups, right? So for instance, Canada Proud, the general issue conservative group focused on unseating the Liberals, focused mostly on Trudeau and his cabinet. The industry focused groups were the most likely to focus on green activists, right? So this discourse played out somewhat differently across these groups. The second most common frame in our sample by far was what we called the bad governance frame, in which bad regulations or legislation was hurting Canadians, workers, and taxpayers. But again, this played out differently based on differing institutional priorities. So during our 2019 sample, industry-linked groups constantly attacked new legislation targeting resource projects tabled by the Liberals, like Bill C-69, which would have strengthened environmental project reviews. Like this meme here, saying that Canada is now closed for business because of this and other similar bills. And these groups also tended to focus on how these new regulations or the inability to get pipelines built would hurt oil and gas workers and provincial tax revenue, which obviously works great in oil producing regions, right? However, the kind of general issue, Canada Proud, with close ties to the Conservative Party, was the only organization attacking the carbon tax, while focusing on the threat to Canadian consumers, not energy workers, which probably makes more electoral sense as this kind of general, general political organization. And I'd say that indicates their position in a broader conservative populist coalition that intersects with these industry-supported movements, and for which fossil fuel development and anti-environmentalism is a core ideological and political concern, but which is often less focused on immediate industry priorities per se, like the more industry-linked groups, right? Again, this strategy often involved the remixing of material and information from different online sources, right? Often reframing it to consistently communicate extractive populist talking points their supporters can reshare. So, and you could see this when they communicated a public national interest frame in which industry's priorities became the priorities of Canadian workers, taxpayers, or simply Canada. So here, a report on limited pipeline capacity from the Fraser Institute, everyone's favorite oil industry-backed climate-denying think tank, becomes a graphic describing industry's losses as Canada, as a nation. The average person, I'm sorry to say, doesn't actually read think tank reports, but this graphic was shared a couple thousand times, right? Here, a TMX, a statement on the TMX pipeline from the Iron Coalition, First Nations group backing the TMX pipeline, helped counter public perception of Indigenous opposition. And the industry supported and focus groups were particularly likely to reshare supporter-generated content to claim the industry is supported by working Canadians, including pictures of supporters wearing pro-industry merch these groups themselves sold. I think this was Canada Action, or provided events they organized. And so industry talking points underwent this kind of populist alchemy. This is not about big oil, this is about Canadian workers, right? Or taxpayers or so on. And who are now under attack by these foreign funded elites, right? And finally, most groups deployed what we called safe and sustainable and ethical oil frames, which position the industry as a leader in ecological sustainability, safety, and human rights, especially when compared with oil-producing dictatorships like Saudi Arabia. So a major goal of this digital strategy then, like I mentioned, was to kind of build an extractive populist echo chamber by strategically linking supporters to content and arguments produced by industry and its allies. Many of these sources of information can be described as members of an extractive discourse coalition the fossil fuel industry has supported or somehow influenced over decades, right? A discourse coalition is just a term for a decentralized network of actors loosely united around the promotion of some shared policy discourses in the public sphere. In this case, the expansion of the oil and gas industry. And this coalition, previous work would identify, firms themselves, industry associations that, give interviews to the press, and this, as well as members of a kind of broader conservative policy discourse coalition, which intersects with the extractivist one, in which industry has also helped support over the decades, especially industry-backed think tanks like the Fraser Institute, arguably a good number of conservative mainstream media commentators and outlets, which I'll get to in a second. So for instance, when we mapped out our sample groups' sharing of third-party materials they themselves had not produced, we found that the industry-supported groups like Canada Action, Energy Citizens, and Oil Respect actually mostly shared material from the same legacy media outlets. In fact, almost all of their mainstream media opinion pieces came from outlets in the conservative-leaning and fiercely pro-fossil fuel post-media chain, like the Calgary Herald and National Post. After 15 years of doing this sort of work, I've just come referring to post-media as the Pravda of Canada's fossil fuel industry, right? I mean, they're extremely well known for this, right? But these same groups also frequently shared stories from specialized oil and gas online trade publications like JWN Energy or BOE Report, many of them owned by the same Western media conglomerate Glacier Media. It's like the think tanks again, right? Like this is stuff that would usually only be read by industry insiders or maybe investors. But at the time of the study had become this constant source of extractive populist op-eds these groups shared, right? And so, as Shane has argued, these sharing practices act as audience subsidies, with advocacy groups directing supporters to friendly media sources at a time of rapidly dwindling readership and subscription, right? Which I argue incentivizes them to produce what I've started calling content subsidies, right? This is going the other way. The production of materials tailor-made for going viral in conservative populist echo chambers, not just because of some algorithmic promotion, but because they know that there are advocacy groups and influencers dying to share that type of material, right? And again, there's both a political and a business logic here, right? I should have done that transition. I shouldn't have put so many transitions in this thing. There's a little picture of some of the JWN Energy stuff that they were sharing, right? Some of the trade publication there. So we also mapped out who was guest writing these media opinion pieces, when it wasn't a regular columnist, and also who these groups cite or quote in their house-made graphics or memes, right? I mean, they're surprisingly well cited, these graphics they make, right? You got these little footnotes everywhere. And we found, much of this material comes from industry-funded think tanks like the Fraser Institute, oil companies like Canadian Natural Resources, or industry associations like CAP, which of course runs Canada Energy Citizens. Canada Energy Citizens spending a lot of time sharing their host organizations' material, right? Again, they're often remixing these groups' dry technocratic material into a more populist register. And so it's important to note here, right, that these industry-linked groups, they're not sharing or remixing material from fringe extremists. Like they're sharing material from some of the most established political and economic actors in the country, right? But this was not necessarily the case with our one general issue populist group, Canada Proud, who didn't share material from mainstream media, think tanks, and so on. The group, again run almost exclusive, the group, again run by Conservative Party communications guru Jeff Ballingall, almost exclusively shared material from the alt-light conservative media outlet Post Millennial, for which Ballingall was also VP of marketing for at the time. So this like really drives home the intersection of political praxis and entrepreneurial profit seeking in the contemporary conservative advocacy space, right? As well as the symbiotic nature of audience subsidies and content subsidies, right? This is a situation where like the same political operator and media entrepreneur sets up an organization to send audiences to a media outlet he helps run, which focuses on producing emotionally charged populist clickbait for his other organization, right? It's a great scheme. And in fact, in recent years, Ballingle has sold Postmillennial to Human Events, an American alt-right, alternative conservative media organization. It's now a clickbait producing farm for them, right? So there's a real business logic here. But again, our study indicates that these intersecting extractivist and conservative discourse coalitions, they're very differentiated, but they'll share broad goals, but they have their own specific political priorities, institutional frameworks, business models, and so on, right? So with this in mind, I just want to very briefly discuss how these groups responded to the Freedom Convoy, because I think that's a kind of an interesting pivot point for this politics. So first, there's obviously a kind of narrative symmetry and also network ties linking extractive populism to increasingly far-right populism in Canada, right? Like the ethical oil argument, which compares Canada's oil favorably to oil from authoritarian Middle Eastern nations, was actually developed by Ezra Levant, originally a Fraser Institute intern, who later went on to found the far-right Rebel Media, which specializes in attacks on Muslim immigrants, amongst other things, right? Later, Yellow Vest started as a campaign against carbon taxes and quickly morphed into a movement against globalist elites and Muslim immigration. And Yellow Vest organizer Tamara Lich, not like head organizer, but she was an organizer in the convoy, actually went on to help organize the convoy and wore Canada Action's I Heart Oil merch to her bail hearings. You've probably seen this famous image, right? From the sonography images, right? And so remember, right, the oil advocates have consistently framed Canada as under attack by a conspiracy of traitorous liberal elites, dishonest media and foreigners, like essentially globalists, right, who lie about science to exploit and control the masses. Well, that's like the basic narrative framework for Yellow Vest ethno-nationalism, QAnon conspiracies, many convoy organizers. However, during the convoy, the industry-linked groups actually never discussed the convoy. Like, it's almost like they were afraid of it. Meanwhile, groups further from direct industry support, like Canada Proud and Oil Sands Strong, came out hard for the convoy, right? Supporting it on rebel media appearances, which these groups never had spent, like the Oil Sands Strong people had never really been involved with, comparing the oppression of peaceful truckers with what they saw as the kids' gloves used for Indigenous-led pipeline blockades, and framing Ottawa citizens as bureaucratic parasites living off tax-paying Canadians. And so these two groups often worked to counter perceptions of extremism and racism with the convoys, and were early and enthusiastic backers of Pierre Poilievre for his pro-convoy, pro-pipeline stance, right? And they also increasingly referred to Trudeau as a dictator for the Emergency Act, while undermining credibility of mainstream media coverage of the convoy, right? And so between them, Proud and Strong at this time had about 600,000 page followers on Facebook, which is a hell of a signal boost. And so I had some final thoughts about, some key insights that might lead into Shane and Darren's presentation, but I've really been over it already, and I'm a little bit over time. So I think this might be a good opportunity to pass it off to Shane.
So I just wanted to begin by noting that I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples out here on the West Coast. I wanted to also thank Tanner and Barbara for the kind invitation to come and speak with you today. And I'm really happy to share the stage with two colleagues and friends, Bob and Darren. So Bob, I think, has done a great job of laying out how core supporters of the fossil fuel industry use Facebook to promote and defend the interests of that industry. And that research built upon some of the previous work that Bob and I and other colleagues had done to initially map this political and ideological formation that we described as extractive populism, which Bob also described in his presentation today. More recently, I have done some work comparing how both right and left public-facing groups have used Facebook to engage with the public about climate change. And I'm happy to chat about that work in the Q&A if there's any interest. But for today, what I thought I would do and have done is put together a more up-to-date, kind of quick and dirty scan of how conservative groups are using Facebook today to push a far-right agenda on climate and energy politics in the country. So who are the key players? How do they fit together? And a little bit on what are they saying, in particular with an emphasis upon which groups and ideas have had the most traction on Facebook, on that platform over the past year. So how did I do it? Quick note on method. So I used CrowdTangle, which is essentially a tool for scraping data from Facebook. Using that, I pulled the top 10,000 posts on Facebook over the last year from Canadian groups that included one of those 8 keywords described there: climate change, wildfire, fossil fuel, natural gas, oil, plus energy, emissions, carbon, and renewable. I then eliminated all of the duplicate posts, as well as every post with less than 50 interactions. So an interaction being a like, a share, a comment, or a reaction. And that generated a sample for this particular presentation of just under 22,000 posts. So using that sample, I then wanted to figure out, well, which pages on Facebook are getting the most traction around those keywords. And so this chart shows the top 20 pages from that list. So looking at that list, looking in particular at the named pages along the bottom, what probably jumps out here, hopefully jumps out here, is the right-wing orientation, right, of most of these top groups, and really the absence of any real progressive organizations, right? So welcome to Facebook in Canada, as I'm sure the people on this webinar are familiar with that dynamic. So 14 of the top 20 are right-wing pages. And just to divide them into groups that sort of loosely parallels some of what Bob was doing, we have politicians. We have industry supporter pages. So just quickly, CCMBC, for those of you not up on your Canadian Business Lobby acronym, stands for Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Then we have what I would call populist outrage machines. And then last, but definitely not least, we have far-right media. Now, as I suggested, there are only 2 nominally, and I emphasize the word nominally, progressive pages in the mix. Our Prime Minister, whose staff really like to insert the word climate change into every post they possibly can, irrespective of how hollow and generic and hypocritical, one might say, those references are. And we also have IFL Science, which is run by LabX Media, a Toronto-based social media marketing company that really has no commitment to Canadian content. It just hosts pages here, so that's why it's in the sample. The search also picked up 2 wildfire-based pages, not really substantively intervening in this discourse, but they did show up. And then finally, we have CTV and CBC News. So the vertical bars there show the total interactions for each page over the year's sample of posts. And then the color coding shows the proportion that is associated with each of those keywords. So you can say who is engaging most prominently on what. So blue for carbon, orange for oil and energy, and so on. You can see the color coding along the bottom there. So the keyword carbon was what definitely pulled in the most engagement from the sample as a whole, with all of that coming from references to the carbon tax. Next in the overall sample was climate change, then wildfires, emissions, and oil and energy. The order was a little bit different for this top 20 sample, but you can see carbon is clearly what is driving a lot of the engagement there. So I built my core sample then based upon these top 14 pages. And then I added a few additional ones that didn't crack the top 20, but were high enough and I think important enough on the list to merit inclusion. Oil Sands Strong, which Bob referenced a number of times. 3 additional pages from the Canada Strong and Proud network. Ontario Proud, which is affiliated with Canada Proud, but distinct from the Canada Strong and Proud Network. It's sometimes hard to keep track of all the prouds and the strongs. And anyways, Friends of Science, who are, of course, anything but. The Western Standard, which is added to the far-right media cluster, and then a few conservative activists that had really only a handful of posts, but very high engagement on these keywords. So right there, that core sample of 24 pages from 18 different groups, I would say that represents most of the top players who are pushing the discourse of extractive populism on Facebook. So the next thing I did was some basic network mapping of the engagement that these groups have generated over the past year around those 8 keywords. So in this visual, the size of the squares illustrates the relative internal engagement of each page. So internal engagement, the way that I would define it, refers to self-directed interactions that a page is generating for its own content. So this is an example. In this post, the Canadian Energy Centre, which was really quite prominent, a bit of a surprise to me in some respects, but I guess I shouldn't be. Anyways, in this post, the Canadian Energy Centre is linking back to its own campaign, supportcanadianenergy.ca. And as you can see here, the Canadian Energy Centre was actually, it attracted the most internal engagement in the sample, followed closely by the Conservative Leader. Also noteworthy here are alt-right media, which have proven, and you cannot overstate this, they have proven remarkably effective, at least until about 6 weeks ago, at using Facebook as a distribution platform, to the point where, as this chart shows, True North over the past year routinely attracted comparable levels of engagement to CTV and the CBC, and significantly more than the Toronto Star, right? This is a kind of conservative alt-right startup news organization that very few people not in the alt-right hadn't heard about a couple of years ago. So really, really striking. More sobering and disappointing there, I included it for comparative value, is how left-leaning alt media, like the Narwhal, which is a fantastic resource, produces fantastic climate and energy journalism, it has very, very small footprint on Facebook compared to True North. Now, so that's the visual again of internal engagement. In this next visual, the size of the squares changes to show external engagement. So just to show you, there's internal, there's external. So external is outward directed engagement. So these are interactions that are generated when one page is linking to or posting content from a different page. So here's an example. Oil Sands Strong linking to a talk by fossil fuel snake oil salesman Alex Epstein, held by the Alberta Prosperity Project. Now, as you could probably see in that transition, most of the blue boxes here are smaller in this slide than they were in the previous slide, and that reflects the self-promotional orientation of most of these larger groups. In part, I think, reflecting that sort of entrepreneurial ethos of a lot of these groups that are really as much in it for the profits they're making as for their political and ideological objectives, or at least those two things come together. Now, in terms of that logic doesn't work for the Canadian Energy Centre, but that's the box that's probably most noteworthy there, as well as the alt media outlets. Those organizations are almost exclusively using Facebook to promote their own content. So they're not sending people elsewhere, they're using it to promote their own content. But that engagement is still building networks in terms of engaging users and getting users to share their content with their friends, family, and so on. So the next visual presents a network map. And there's a lot of information on that, but this network map shows the connections between those core pages and what they're linking to. So the link to pages and organizations are the black circles, And the size of those black circles corresponds to the volume of the incoming interactions. And then the width of the gray lines there, which are actually arrows, that shows the volume of engagement that one page is sending to another. Now, network maps like that are often really crowded. They're sort of hard to make out patterns. So let's simplify that by removing all of the links that have less than 500 interactions. That's probably a little bit easier to see those key relationships. The most obvious of those relationships, as Bob already alluded to, are between core sample groups and content from post-media newspapers. And they're primarily linking to right-wing columnists like Laurie Goldstein, Brian Lilly, Rex Murphy. These are key soldiers in the right media war, if you will, right? In terms of translating ideas and arguments into a vernacular that ideally from their perspective resonates with a much broader population. So this visual highlights all of those links to post-media in red, with the key drivers being conservative politicians and industry supporter groups. Now here, the sort of elephant in the room in terms of this talk, Facebook's recent decision to ban Canadian news content has and will change these patterns. Even before that August ban, Facebook had been ramping down the prominence of news content in its algorithm, which raises the question, how is that going to affect social media ecosystems and echo chambers? Well, notwithstanding conservative hostility to so-called gatekeepers, right? Something Mr. Polyev talks about all the time. I think this shift in Facebook will amplify the power of conservative gatekeepers, the blue boxes on this chart, to curate the circulation of news or news bits, news fragments that fits their political and ideological agenda. Here's how I think that, here's how it happens and how I think that will continue to happen. So this particular post promotes a claim about EVs taken from Blacklock's Reporter. Blacklock's Reporter is a small, nonpartisan media outlet that focuses upon Ottawa and the federal government. Proud to be Canadian here uses that claim to push the broader narrative that renewable technology doesn't work. It won't work well for Canadians. Canadians know this. Canadians are concerned about this, quote, and instead we should be able to rely on our best in the world, oil and gas, and use carbon tech to make it net zero. This was a big theme in the last year, right? Raising questions about renewable technology. Now, in this post, there's no link that enables one to assess that claim in the context of the article. Just an isolated but easily shareable factoid that is harnessed to this broader narrative, right? The challenges, the appeal, the desirability, the possibility of decarbonization, but that also appropriates the legitimacy of a news outlet to bolster its credibility. This is a key reason why, as Bob suggested, all of these groups footnote their claims. It's not because they necessarily care about being transparent. It's because that enhances the credibility, the nominal credibility of what they're doing. This single post received over 50,000 interactions, which is close to twice as many as the Facebook page for Blacklock's Reporter got over the entire year, right? Now, as again, Bob talked about in his talk, that basic formula has been the modus operandi for industry supporter groups like Canada Action over the past decade, with a huge chunk of their high engagement content consisting precisely of what I would describe as these meme-like interventions. Those patterns are only going to intensify. News is not going to disappear, but news is going to be mined for these little factoids that can be shared, that can be turned into memes. And that's the logic that I think will come to dominate the presence of news on Facebook into the future. So here's an example of how Canada Action has done that repeatedly. Okay, so here's a final graphic that shows the network with the size of the boxes adjusted to reflect both internal and external engagement. That, I think, is a really good map of who the key players are in the network, the engagement they attract, and how they connect to one another. Bob already laid out some of the key tenets of extractive populism and how they feature in the communication of these groups. So I wanted to finish with a couple of final thoughts on the content of those pages that generates the most engagement. Now, the easiest thing to do in a presentation like this is to focus upon the most outrageous examples of disinformation that affirm our presumptions about these networks and their audiences and the contents that they share. Now, in this case, that would be this video from True North entitled "The Truth About Canadian Wildfires." Again, anything but. This was the second most popular post in the core sample. It attracted over 45,000 interactions and close to 500,000 views, at least as Facebook counts them. Now, based on that screenshot, you can probably guess at the content, which one claimed that the principal cause of the horrendous wildfires in the summer was arson, not climate change. And two, argues that media and liberal elites pushed the climate connection because, quote, climate change opens the door for government bureaucrats to get another hit of that sweet, sweet taste of controlling the masses. Note the comment question there: will climate lockdowns become a reality in our lifetime? Gee, I wonder. The definition of a rhetorical question. True North aggressively promoted this line throughout the summer. And remember, again, over the last couple of years, their overall engagement on Facebook rivaled CBC and CTV in terms of the prominence of news outlets. Now, any mention of climate on the site is on True North is essentially used to promote explainer video segments that feature interviews with noted climate deniers like Mark Morano, Patrick Moore, Ross McKittrick. Beyond the straight up disinformation in these videos, they also situate climate change within, and this has become, I think, the most prominent narrative amongst these groups. They situate climate change within a kind of right-wing shock doctrine, right? Framing it as a manufactured crisis hyped up by left-wing elites, left-wing media to justify and expand eco-authoritarianism. That's the basic narrative here. And that's a claim that obviously resonates with the sort of pandemic type conspiracy theorists around COVID. That's the sort of thing that's unifying a lot of these groups and content together. So lots of material like that in the sample. But, and this might be the only slightly provocative thing I'll say in this presentation, if the only thing that we focus upon are more extreme forms of disinformation that go viral, which is easy enough to do, I think we are missing a big part of how these networks operate, what their political impacts are, and why they generate audience engagement. And here I'm inspired by Naomi Klein's new book, Doppelganger, which I'm working my way through, highly, highly recommended. One of her core themes is how far-right networks constitute a kind of mirror world in which we find political claims and, more importantly, political emotions that often bear this uncanny, if superficial, and ultimately perverted and distorted resemblance to more radical ideas and sentiments. And skimming through these networks, I often find myself torn between, one, outrage at the falsehoods that they peddle, at the toxic politics that they are promoting, but also simultaneously a fascination with their efficacy, their effectiveness in using social media platforms to do things that I so wish the climate left was better at doing. Lots of things I could say about this, but I'm just going to close with one. And that is the extent to which all of the main players in this network were unified in promoting conservative politicians and, by implication, mainstream politics, elections, as the key to implementing a far-right political program. You know what the most popular type of content shared in the sample was? It wasn't memes. It wasn't links to Jordan Peterson. It was this. It was video from CPAC, the cable public affairs channel, primarily consisting of clips from Question Period in the House of Commons. Those clips accounted for 11 of the top 20 posts in the sample and attracted close to 4 million views. Now, beyond the content of those clips, and they were almost all about the carbon tax, the underlying message is that having people in the House of Commons who are able and willing to stand up for your interests and values is something worth celebrating, worth sharing with your social networks, and worth organizing to support. Aside from that wildfire conspiracy video, all of the other top posts from True North that far-right media outlet, they were all stories lauding conservative politicians for fighting the good fight against Trudeau. There is, in other words, a kind of conservative sociological imagination at work here that we ignore at our peril. A narrative that only pins the blame for the affordable crisis upon, pins the blame for the affordable crisis upon elite institutions and climate policies like the carbon tax. It's doing that, but it's also positioning political engagement and mobilization as the best means of addressing it. If you look at True North on YouTube, the most popular video is about an election in which a Dutch farmers' protest party did surprisingly well electing senators to oppose government plans to reduce nitrogen emissions. Now, we should understand and expose how a story like that spreads misinformation about agriculture and climate change, but we also need to understand how it is cultivating political efficacy. The outrage machines are constantly pumping out material that frames federal politics as a simple and stark choice between conservatives who will act decisively to implement policies that you like, defend things that matter to you, and a progressive coalition that has been captured by elites that threatens your well-being and hates your values. And I'll finish with this. It's hard to see that and not wonder about the impact of a more robust alliance between left social movements and political parties that fought for and reflected each other's priorities. Imagine, for example, a coordinated campaign that relentlessly targeted corporate profiteering as a threat to our individual and collective well-being, which it, of course, is. A campaign with a coherent and consistent message across the spectrum of social movements, environmental groups, labor unions, Indigenous rights advocates, social justice organizations, a campaign that was linked up with politicians that used every platform they had to hammer home the danger of corporate profiteering and what to do about it. And imagine if that message was affirmed by a constant flow of memeable factoids, data points from left-leaning think tanks and experts, combined with journalism regularly exposing the scale of this profiteering, how it threatens our democracy, its devastating impacts upon the people and places we love, and a plan for what we can do to stop it. The building blocks for that campaign, they are all there. But when you look to the mirror world of social media, this is what you find in terms of narratives that have traction, explaining the affordability crisis and inflation. So these screenshots again are from CrowdTangle. Keyword corporate profits over the last year, 1,100 posts, 115,000 interactions. Keyword carbon tax, 8,000 posts, over 2 million interactions. Those are the top posts. Misleading, inaccurate, manipulative, but compelling and eminently shareable explanations of how and why the carbon tax is driving inflation, and explanations that may very well play a key role in putting conservatives back into power in the federal government in the not too distant future. So I know I've gone over my time. I'm going to stop there and pass things over to Darren. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob and Shane, for what you've shared so far. I think you've given us already an incredible amount to think about. And so I look forward to just adding a little bit to that in terms of a little thinking in many ways where these kind of online networks transpose into physical networks on the ground, which I think is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Similar to Shane, I'm coming at you today from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations here in Vancouver. My background is blurred because I'm in a very chaotic place. So if for some reason you see me jump out of the screen, it's because I've got 3 kids. Okay, so today I want to talk about a little bit about Convoy, more so about petro-nationalism, but also thinking in terms of faith. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background here. So my particular research, my most recent research focused on primarily the intersections between Christian identities and fossil fuels in cultural politics in Canada. And I looked at both articulations of faith that were supportive of oil and gas industry, but also articulations of faith that opposed it. And the reason why I spent so much time looking at that particular faith tradition is because it is still the tradition that the majority of Canadians express membership or belief in when it comes to Canadian census data. So I've got this image here on the screen, and I'll primarily be talking mostly about those groups that you could that align with a lot of the ideologies that we saw on the ground at various convoy protests across Canada. Though I think I need to state at the outset that that's not necessarily the entire picture of that particular faith tradition in Canada. I've also met many committed faith activists who've been arrested at protests opposing fossil fuels. So it isn't necessarily a monolithic belief in that sense when it comes to petropolitics. Okay, so I've got this image here, and I want to just notice three things about this image. We've got a man, and that's important. Actually, I guess it's four things. We've got a man, we've got a yellow vest, we've got a Canada flag, and we've got a jerry can. And that jerry can has a slogan on it that says "filled with love." And when I see an image like this, I think of it somewhat in the ironic way that a soldier in a war might write a note to the enemy on a bomb, which there's kind of an I don't know if these statements always come across as ironic, given what we know about how a lot of the convoy protests unfolded. So to begin, I want to talk about this term. Bob did a great job of, I think, introducing it, and I just want to make sure we have a good sense of it when we're thinking about the intersections that we're talking about today. And that's just simply this definition that petro-nationalism, is a framework promoting extractivism as a national public good and positioning critics as anti-Canadian and foreign to the body politic. And that's going to become very important here. To this definition, I would also add underlying logics, right, that express ideas of things like fairness, progress, and even what work looks like. What forms of labor build the nation versus what other forms are articulated as secondary, right? Essentially heavy industries versus professional environmentalists, right? I think Bob talked a little bit about this, in terms of who actually labors to build the state and who essentially feeds off of it. And this becomes important in those populist understandings of deserving and undeserving Canadians that comes out of some of the memes that we've seen shared by both Bob and Shane. I would also suggest that within this framework is what we call a kind of commonsensical and really casual, and when I say common sense, read ideology, articulation of divine providence. Okay, so as former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney said on his election night, we Canadians have been blessed with the world's third largest oil reserves and abundance of natural gas. And I don't think that use is accidental. You may also, those of us who are old enough in the room to remember that when Stephen Harper first became Prime Minister, he used the phrase "God bless Canada" at the end of his inauguration speech, I believe in 2006, and set off somewhat of a firestorm in Canada because Canadian politicians tend not to speak the language of faith. We have many faiths represented in Canadian leadership, but speaking it is a little bit different in the Canadian context. Okay, so I thought we could think about this conversation with this very simple question, because I think it's such a complex topic, especially when we're talking about convoy and the various branches that feed into that movement. I kind of relied a little bit on my early training in materialist history, going way back to my undergrad, I guess, which is essentially you find an object, and in that object you unpack the ideologies that you see embedded within it. So I thought I would just ask this question, which is, and it's actually, to me, a simple question, but I think really gets at the heart of what we're talking about, which is, how did a gasoline jerry can become the symbol of a protest against COVID policy in Canada, right? This is a protest expressed at least by their leaders in response to the federal Liberals' position on COVID. And yet this becomes one of the most important images or symbols of that particular protest. Here's some more images of that here. And so I've been thinking about this signifier for some time. And if everyone doesn't remember, essentially, the police said no more fuel coming in to run the trucks, and police started confiscating jerry cans. So then everyone, well, at least not everyone, but certainly many people within the convoy, as a strategy to outsmart the police, began to just buy up jerry cans. Some of them would be empty, some of them would be full of fuel, and it confused the police and still enabled fuel to get to trucks during the convoy. An interesting kind of right-wing version of culture jamming, you might say. And so I've been thinking about the signifier, and as I kind every time the more and more I looked at Convoy, I just kind of kept seeing three things, which is trucks, flags, and jerry cans, right? Again, this is at least as stated, a protest against COVID, okay, and COVID policy in Canada. And then I began to think, and I think as many in the room would observe, that this word, right, freedom convoy, right, begins kind of be positioned as front and center. And so they're making significant claims about this word freedom. And it's not just any type of freedom, but one uniquely wedded, I think, to the two most powerful promises of petro-modernity, right? Mobility and consumption, right? Mobility and consumption. So when we see that word freedom, when we see the jerry can, what we're really talking about is mobility and consumption, which of course, COVID policies, if we're thinking in terms of having to be vaccinated to go to particular places or having to wear a mask to go into a restaurant, this actually affects kind of these long-standing promises. And it appears that, as you can see on the screen, there's a particular constituency in Canada that is very unnerved when questions of mobility and consumption are taken away, or when barriers to those two promises of oil are at play. And this is where federal COVID policy, I think I already said this, becomes an actionable equivalence of a much broader ideological formation. So essentially, COVID equals oil. That's what we would think of as an ideological equivalence. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit more using this. Okay, so many of you may recognize the words written on the back of this truck here. If it's too small on your screen, it says, "Canada, we stand on guard for thee." And of course, this is the final lines of Canada's national anthem. And some of you may also be familiar with the lines that precede this refrain, which of course is, "God keep our land glorious and free." Okay, God keep our land glorious and free. And then the statement, I think, is an identification of Convoy's intentions to act as a remnant, so to speak, that will defend Canada, essentially a core vanguard of true Canadians that will hold on to the true principles of the nation. Okay, so then what are those true principles and who gets to define them? I think I wrote on the slide here, whose God, whose land, whose understanding of glory, which think of that as prosperity, and whose understanding of free, right? And here I'm actually really interested in the work of Canadian religious scholar Christine Mitchell, who writes a lot of observations about Christian nationalism in Canada. Although I think we need to make it clear that there's all sorts of branches going into what Convoy became, and certainly there were, as many scholars have noted, Christian nationalists, in particular white Christian nationalist elements. So this is not to say that those who participate in Convoy are Christians by any means, but rather that there was an ideological alignment or secular engagement with Convoy, you might argue, and the broader cultural logic that Canada's prosperity is rooted in a Western Christian framework of values and ideas. So again, you do not have to be Christian to believe necessarily in the Western Christian framework, if that makes sense. So essentially, the divine prosperity, there is this settler nation that has this abundance of natural resources, and we are blessed to have that. And to critique that blessing is then to challenge this broader settler narrative that really, I find, quite actually at the core, right? If we go back again to that petro-modernity claim about consumption and mobility. Okay, so then, and so what I'm hoping I've kind of developed so far is this sense of, we're using Ernest Laclau's term here, of equivalencies, ideologically, again, that make it possible to link just a few of the following things: jerry cans, nationalism, parent rights, freedom, liberty, faith, masculinity, climate change, and the critique of climate change, prosperity, and even gender, under a broader petro-populist or petro-nationalist umbrella, right? Where these things become to stand in for one another. Here, I actually think a lot of the work of Kara Daggett, who of course wrote an incredible paper called Petro-Masculinity, Fossil Fuels, and Authoritarian Desire. And I think it's really important to think the way that the masculine identities that were often presented in Convoy, in particular, you know, the big trucks and the fuel and the uniforms, the working uniforms that many participants wore as kind of symptomatic of a masculine undertone, or you might even call it overtone to that particular protest. And Cara Daggett's really interesting because she asks us to actually take this very seriously, right? That fossil fuels have kind of become these potent symbols of autonomy and self-sufficiency, which then begin to be attached to things like hierarchies and particular understandings of how the social world should work. Here is Daggett's really kind of big offering in terms of linking petro-masculinity to climate denial, which is just saying, look, if there's a particular ideological constellation that understands mobility and consumption as the core idea of freedom, just imagine, right? If this is how the population reacts to having to wear a mask to go to a restaurant, Cara Daggett kind of offers a bit of an ominous look towards the future to say, well, what does it look when real, intensified restraints on certain understandings of mobility and consumption are constrained. The other thing I would, is let's go to here. Okay, so I wanted to then get back to our idea of the jerry can. So as we all know, one of the interesting things about many of the critiques of Justin Trudeau is you always have to ask, you always look to what the critique is, right? Many of us have critiques of Trudeau, but those critiques aren't necessarily the same. This is one that has become quite popular out of the jerry can iconography. Many of you might be familiar with this particular gaffe, and Trudeau, of course, is often gaffe prone, where he kind of fumbles through this question about what his family does for the environment, and then he makes a statement. We use this water bottle drink box sort of thing. And this, of course, has been written on, becomes part of the iconography around the jerry can at Convoy. And this kind of leads me to, as I kind of surfing through some of the same right-wing online worlds that Shane and Bob are in, you come across countless memes of Trudeau that aren't just critique of his hypocrisy or whether or not he's, Fidel Castro's child, but critiquing him on his masculinity, right? And the way that he's particularly coded. As I recall a meme just a couple of days ago that said, even how he sits pisses me off, right? And in that particular, then there's an image of Trudeau and he's just got his hands folded with his legs close together. Essentially, he's not man-spreading, and that pisses this particular constituency off, right? Because he presents his masculinity differently. And that kind of leads us to these, I've often been some of the vitriol that's thrown at Justin Trudeau is in many ways quite shocking, because you're trying to understand that this can't just be about fossil fuels, right? Especially from a prime minister who bought a pipeline and approved Bay du Nord, right? This cannot just be about that. It has to be, again, this constellation of ideas, these equivalencies that link all of these particular ideologies together. Here, of course, is Pat King, who's on trial right now, defending his statement, Trudeau, someone's going to make you take a bullet one day, I believe is what he said in an interview with the Fifth Estate. What's actually interesting about this particular claim is Pat King then goes on to make this statement right after, right? And again, I kind of go back to my real interest in the language of faith and how it's used. And here Pat King is saying, look, we all have to meet our maker one day and we need to see our maker, kind of drawing on these kind of Christian languages in this really kind of interview where he's trying to defend these types of statements. This is a video to go back to I think this video had about 170,000 views on YouTube. This is just one of many that you can see about kind of when the jerry cans began to arrive. This particular author of this video, not even sure, you hear this kind of audio track where the person is recording. It says, play your next move, Trudeau, you F-head. I won't say the word here, but again, the kind of vitriol, right, that you wouldn't necessarily expect towards a prime minister who has bought a pipeline for this particular constituency. The language of faith, again, this is something I'm consistently interested in. This is when we kind of get to those kind of underlying maybe, Western Christian exceptionalist narratives and these kind of different arms and understandings that feed into Convoy. Here is James Bowder. He is also on trial for his role in Convoy, and I think his partner Sandra is as well. When he's asked in an interview, why did you start Convoy? Because of course, James Bowder was actually what became known as the Freedom Convoy was actually the Convoy for Freedoms, or the other way around. But James Bowder essentially was one of the core core instigators of Convoy, and he responded essentially that God told him to do it, right? And so this is really interesting to think of these intersections where, you know, you don't have to be a believer necessarily in the type of faith that Bowder expresses at Convoy to necessarily still find yourself aligned, if that makes sense, right? You can kind of be a secular supporter, but agree in principle within these kind of Western Christian acceptance understanding of prosperity and blessing, and, you know, kind of the divine settler history of Canada. Here's James Bowder in what turns out to be quite a controversial picture recently done with the Premier of Alberta. If you go to Bowder's Twitter page, this was me surfing on the internet the other day, you kind of see these other kind of equivalencies, right? We got discussions of the woke, what is it called? Go woke, go broke meme, which is kind of a popular right-wing meme about companies that take on the iconography of rainbow flags and things like that. Here he is, I think, making a comment about the Toronto Maple Leafs changing their policy on their rainbow jersey. That's the one on the top right there. Okay, and then I think we're probably going to end up here because I want to finish up our time, but I want to show kind of one last of these kind of interesting equivalencies. This, of course, is Rebel Media, which I think ran, or I'm not sure if they're still running this campaign, at least it was up when I most recently looked, which is to fundraise for Pastor Artur Pawlowski. If you're not familiar with Pawlowski, he gave a speech at the Coutts blockade, and I'll just give you the actual statement that he said. For freedom to preserve, people must be willing to sacrifice their lives. This is our time. If this is our Alamo, then so be it. That's from a CBC article. But again, Pawlowski was arrested and has been charged. And I think, not sure about the current state of his trial, but again, another kind of popular, I'm not sure how popular Arthur is, but a Christian leader or someone expressing pretty strong Christian nationalist beliefs tied up within the broader conversations around Convoy. Yeah, this is just, I just have this slide here and then I think I'll finish up. When we begin to think about kind of the filter bubbles and the networks, this is just me again, just briefly, visiting Artur Pawlowski's page, and then immediately it's suggested that I like the following three people. If you're not familiar with the top person, that's Christine Anderson, who is a fairly well-known, I believe, member of the German parliament for the Alternative for Germany party, which is a far-right party in Germany. Theo Fleury, who of course was speaking on Fox News about COVID policies in Canada. And Nadine Ness, who I believe started a grassroots kind of family COVID organization and is also has expressed a lot of Christian beliefs. So again, this is just a random, I'm not on Twitter very much. This is just me actually going to Arthur's page, and this is what Twitter, or I guess X now, suggests I might also like. Also interesting, Arthur's son spoke to the European Parliament about the tyranny in Canada related to his father's arrest in Calgary. Okay, we won't talk about this. We won't talk about that. Maybe we'll end on this last bit of iconography. This is interesting. Diana Dean, who I think was part of the official police oversight committee in Ottawa, was actually found a jerry can left for her at her office, I think as Convoy was winding down, just as kind of a friendly reminder from those who I guess were there. Okay, I'll end there.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, Shane, and Darren. I mean, those were just seamlessly integrated presentations that were complementary and informative in so many ways. I have like 4 pages of notes here I just took down with a whole bunch of sub-questions I would love to share with you. But we have folks in the audience that are warmly welcome to post your questions first. So I think the first question is, what's happening now that, again, Facebook has been closed to news media posts? Like, what has happened to these kind of, right-wing and far-right sort of misinformation, disinformation posters and populists around climate issues on these platforms now that essentially news stories can't be posted in Canada?
Sure, I can take that really quickly. Yeah, it was actually a challenge in terms of doing the research, because often CrowdTangle would scrape metadata, but you'd have a link to a post, you go to the post, and it would say, people in Canada cannot see this content anymore. So it really has been shut down very quickly. What I did find, though, as I alluded to, is that there are other ways of sharing news content. So you can't share links to news. But there were often where there would be a photo and then a particular extract. You can certainly continue to meme news. And I think that that's still what you're going to see. I suspect there's going to be, or there's definitely a big dip in terms of traffic. And you could see that on the slide where I showed True North, and all of the media organizations really ramped down in August because they were all just frozen out. But I think what you'll see is that sort of mining of right-wing news content for little factoids that can then be shared, and the signifiers of the news outlets will be put on the memes to enhance their credibility. That is going to, it'll probably take a little while to ramp up those particular machines, but I suspect it will only amplify the conservative gatekeepers in terms of the way in which they're drawing upon these outlets to pass on this material. I also think that just as many of us are probably on newsletters for alternative media on the left, and they've been using this justifiably as a means to sort of raise funding and say, this is one of our primary means of engaging with readers. So now it's been taken away. We need you to help. We need you to share our stuff. The right is doing exactly the same thing. So True North has been really pushing this as a fundraising mechanism and as a means of exploiting other networks to, sustain audiences. So yeah, that's maybe hopefully a short answer to that.
Very helpful, Shane. Thank you. So the next question is from Anna, and there's two parts. The first is a method question. The second one is, I think, related to left strategy and tactics on social media platforms. The first is just when doing research on social media and interactions with posts, numbers of likes, followers, how do you take into account bots? How do you measure sort of authenticity and user engagement with these posts? And are these posts, I guess, generated by people, organizations, or are there sort of algorithmic forms of bottification happening here?
I can say a word on that one quickly too. The short answer is I don't have a really good method for that. I think that's actually one of the things that makes research on social media really challenging, is that it's hard to make those distinctions. One certainly has access to a Facebook ad library, which is helpful at a sort of rudimentary level. So one of the biggest advertisers, for example, on Facebook that's disclosed through Facebook ad library are the political parties. Conservative Party, big advertiser. Canadian Energy Centre has spent about $1 million over 4 years on Facebook ads. So that can give you some sense. And certainly I would say that a lot of their engagement it's not necessarily bot driven, but it's absolutely boosted. And they are putting a lot of money into that. I don't think that means we can necessarily discount it, just like, messages that have a lot of promotional resources behind them are often still very effective. They may not be particularly organic, but they're often very, very effective. The other thing that I think can be useful in terms of this sort of research is maybe to take the absolute numbers with a grain of salt, but to, in a sample, try and construct a sort of comparative group. So in my sense, what I always really like to look at is, how are the right groups doing? How are the left groups doing? And it's that comparative dimension that I think can be more helpful rather than the absolute numbers. And also within a given page, for example, the comparative numbers within that page, right? Because when you look at the metadata, there's big differences in terms of which posts attract a lot of engagement and which don't. Having said that, that doesn't provide a kind of bulletproof way of identifying the extent to which bots and or other forms of promotion are pushing it, but it gives you some kind of directional indicators. And I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add to that.
So the second question for the audience is, the right is clearly winning, right, on the social media platforms. Why? And why is the left and environmental groups doing so poorly in comparison?
So I can build off, some knowledge in terms of work I've done even previously with Shane. When the work that I presented on, as I said, was kind of building off of the work I'd been working on, a project that Shane was leading. And actually, Darren and I both worked as RAs on a follow-up project where we basically did this type of research you saw at my first presentation, but for the Green Left. And there are a few things that really stood out. One was that, when we looked at the right, like the way I was able to say, hey, there's this extractive populist narrative in a nutshell, I can say it in 2 sentences. Well, if you look at it, there's there are actually like 8 or 9 frames in those 2 sentences, but it's a clear, emotionally coherent story, and everyone was on message. Like even if Canada Proud had a different take on it than Oil Seen as Strong, like it was not that hard to just say, here are the 15 top talking points, and they're on it relentlessly. They're on it at like the same time. I think the right is extremely good at working together. Like I think the kind of the elite driven, I think that even dates back to like the elite kind of elite politics think tank years. Like there's I think they share strategies, and I think they stay on message. When we looked at what Suzuki was saying and what Dogwood was saying, and what, like you could not, it would be hard to pick out a coherent narrative or storyline from that, even within a single group. And then if you actually looked at what the different groups are saying, it was just a mess, right? It's just like, it was like each group's in, okay, like Suzuki's all about the bees this week, right? But like it has nothing to do with whatever Dogwood and like there's a level of messaging there that I think is just extremely strong. I think secondly, I think they spend money effectively. Like if you look at like, you know, Suzuki and Greenpeace, like they're spending money on Facebook too, but you know, from a rudimentary scan, it seems like they're extremely, the right is just very targeted on what they spend money on. But the other thing that I think doesn't come through, that building off work Shane's done recently that he alluded to, that I think is excellent. He wrote a piece 2 years ago in environmental, in the journal Environmental Communications, is that when you compare the left to the right, those audience subsidies that like the right just, they know to send their people to Post Media, and they know to send their people to True North News. And when I was doing my research, they know to send their people to Post Millennial. They know that there is a, as I said, a business and a political logic. And I was shocked at Shane's previous paper to see that the left and green groups weren't doing that at all. They weren't sending people to the Narwhal. They weren't sending people to the Tyee. They weren't sending people to Observer, not even talking about levels of engagement, which you could gain with bots and so on. But also just like straight up shares, like the number of times they shared, right? Like, which you can't really gain because it's a very intentional metric, right? How many times did the David Suzuki Foundation attempt to share a piece by the Tyee this week? Well, yeah, that's on a number that's very easy to gain, and they don't have that level of discipline, that level of kind of maybe this very coherent and almost crystallized approach that the right has developed. Which I think the very last thing I'll say is not all of this comes from them being like, in a sense, this strategy emerges with them looking at what was working on the left, taking it, appropriating it for themselves, and then refining it. So it's not like the left and the green movements are totally terrible at this, but I do think there is a kind of, there's been some refinements of this strategy, especially the self-conscious building of a networked echo chamber that they did kind of, I think, have just pulled ahead on and done very, very well. And then finally, they own populism right now, and people are pissed off. You know, they own that. Right. And they're not going to be pissed off about all the same things that I'm pissed off about. But one thing I learned from Shane in undergrad was like, if you're angry, just having some guy on Fox News be angry like you, just that effective connection is meaningful. And I think they've just run away with that disenchantment and anger. Like Zoomers and millennials are going to the CPC in massive numbers. It's because they're angry. They're really pissed off, and I think the right's very good at channeling that anger.
Well said. I mean, I wonder if others have something to say about that, but I wanted to pick up on that. I mean, there's something deeper going on as well, beyond like owning populism, spending more money on targeted advertising, right? Knowing sort of how to sort of mobilize in a collective, coherent way. Is there something at just a deeper level related to what Darren said about capitalist modernity, carbon, sort of fossil history, freedom, mobility equals oil, the reproduction of oil culture? Like, is there something there where the prospect of having to change one's life to make a just transition to a more sustainable energy future is challenging collectively and individually. So it's easier to say, I can identify with denialism, deflection, and distortion because it just suits my everyday life as a neoliberal subject within carbon capitalism. Like, is something going on there as well? Or I'm not sure.
I'll jump in here just quickly. I would say that I think at the core of petro-nationalism is kind of the flip side of the abundance isn't this great, is actually a really deep fear about the future. So whereas kind of the progressive left, we often celebrate the possibilities of a collective politics in a more equitably distributed world. I think when you kind of begin to break down the petro-nationalist narrative and then also the equivalencies, there is a whole bunch of fear about not fitting in, not liking the social life in a post-fossil fuel world, not knowing who your neighbors are going to be, about essentially no longer being able to make sense of the world that made sense to you. So, not fitting in, right? This kind of, so yeah, I'm rambling now. I think there's a deep fear, and I think that fear is associated with a lot of things you're describing.
That's a really good point, and I would just build on that. It reminds me of always go back to Antonio Gramsci and his idea of the passive revolution versus versus an active revolution. And he's using that concept to make sense of why the fascists kicked his ass in Italy, right? He was the leader of the Italian Communist Party in pre-war Italy, and his argument was just that fascism didn't have to build a new type of world. What it had to do was kind of find a new way to kind of secure a retrenchment of the old world. And that's a much lower bar. That plays into that level of fear. And I do think there still is a level of left strategy at work there, because by kind of pinning our hopes on this kind of technocratic, green economy, we're not going to have to completely remake the world. We're just going to build better batteries. It's that's not super, I'm not sure if that sort of messaging was up to the level of change that's actually necessary in terms of climate change. And that is scary, especially if no one is giving you a coherent, compelling way that's going to happen. And in that context, the passive revolution, which is always an easier thing to mobilize around, hey, we're going to make it back like it was before. Right. I think that's a really dangerous situation when you look at the type of very deep-seated petroculture that Darren is gesturing to.
Thanks. Shane, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's one that I don't have any easy answers for. I think, though, I do think it's important to sort of distinguish between that and the more prosaic tactical questions, because I do think that there are interventions that can be made there more effectively than groups are doing. And I think sometimes questions of money and questions of those sort of broader, for lack of sort of epistemological, existential questions, sometimes stand in the way of, I think, really important reflexivity on the part of social movements about why their communications and mobilization strategies might not be working as effectively as they are. So one of the things that I've seen a lot in terms of climate is they've got more money. And that's just, well, we're just going to lose because they have more money. It's true that they have more money, but it's also true that they have more money and we don't have a choice but to try and be more nimble, more creative, more effective, more experimental in terms of using platforms that you might argue are structurally set against sort of left political objectives, but that's still the world that we work within. So I think there has to be sort of both. It's sort of an and question in terms of we need to really think more critically about how to improve our communicative interventions and strategies, and at the same time being attentive to, as you I think really nicely point out, as and both Bob and Darren have talked about, those sort of bigger problems, if you will. But I'll just close with this thought, and that is that if you were a conservative in the 1970s in Alberta or the 1980s in Alberta, if you were a conservative in the 1990s, you would have identified Canada as a huge problem to overcome. The associations with what it meant to be Canadian, what Canadian political culture involved, right? I mean, it's most people are probably familiar or can probably remember Harper's very famous 1997 definition of Canada as a small Northern European welfare state in the worst sense of the word. And he attacked Canadians for being proud of it. right? That was what he said in the 1990s. In the National Energy Program debates of the 1980s, Canada was the enemy if you were the fossil fuel industry. And yet in a period of about 15 years, they flipped that. They flipped that narrative very, very effectively. So that at least is sort of expressive of the shifting and dynamic terrain in which we're operating. And I do think that as the climate crisis becomes so much more intense, and so much more of a direct and perceptible and obvious threat to people's security and well-being and so on, there are going to be real opportunities for more creative narratives on the left that try and connect, maybe more substantively, more creatively, those existential fears, those experiences of deprivation and insecurity, to more compelling narratives around decarbonization and, you know, building a better future. It's a very dynamic terrain, and so I think we need to be attentive and constantly pushing the boundaries and constantly trying to figure out what can work more effectively than we do now. So.
Well said, Shane, right? You know, common sense, the national popular, the international popular. These are malleable trains of contestation and conflict over which different blocs fight it out. And I think what's absolutely needed is the political will, creativity, and organization to articulate all those fragments, as you say, into some bloc capable of articulating a new common sense from the old toward a new and better sustainable future. And that's a lot of political work, but I think that's exactly what is needed. So just as the last reflections, folks, I mean, everybody that's here tonight, please read the publications and works by these wonderful researchers. But do you have any sort of, if you one recommendation for things for folks to read, what would they be on these topics?
I could just say again the one that I said in my talk, and that is Naomi Klein's Doppelganger. I actually think that's a really, really insightful, thoughtful, and at times self-critical reflection upon the place we're in and the right disposition to take to trying to understand these mirror world shadowlands and our place within them. So I would highly recommend that.
And it's an older Naomi Klein book, but she's a fabulous chapter on her book. In her book, This Changes Everything. One of the earlier chapters that said called "The Right is Right," which is just about the idea that there are certain elements. This kind of speaks a little bit to, you know, some of the conversation has been. There's certain elements, the like climate denial or anti-climate change right was in some ways a little bit more realistic actually than like the way that fossil fuels were entangled with capitalism, our entire way of life and our economy, than some of like the more the naive and maybe even kind of centrist technocratic aspects of the environmental kind of center left, right? And I think that's a really just that even that chapter from that book is, I think, even though it's a few years old now, is quite prescient. I think it would speak to a lot of the issues we were talking about today.
I'm still constantly going back to Kara Daget's essay, Petro-masculinity. I think it's, you know, if you're not, you don't necessarily have to be interested in Freud to read it. You know, there's a lot of Freud in there, but it's a very, I think, meaningful proposition to suggest that that our barriers aren't technical, our barriers are cultural.